Good morning. This is John Rhodes, Chair of the Public Service Commission and Chair of the Board on Electric Generation, Siting, and the Environment. And I call this meeting of that board to order. Could folks please mute if you're not speaking? Before we get started, I would like to note our arrangements for the meeting today. In line with the guidelines concerning social distancing and minimizing large gatherings, and in keeping with the executive orders suspending provisions of the Opens Meeting Law on an emergency basis, we are conducting today's meeting remotely. I'd like to remind those who are participating by phone to please mute their lines except when they are speaking. The public will have the opportunity to listen to the meeting by going to the department's webcast page, and we will also record and transcribe the meeting as has been our practice. These arrangements have been reviewed by our General Counsel, and he has found that they meet the requirements of the executive orders and that they meet my own expectations of honoring the intent of the Open Meetings Law. Before moving to the agenda, I would like to introduce the alternates representing the permanent members of the Siting Board. After I say your name and affiliation, could you please respond that you're here? Louis Alexander, alternate of Basil Sagos, Department of Environmental Conservation.
Here.
Thank you. Dr. Elizabeth Lewis-Michael, alternate of Dr. Howard Zucker, Department of Health.
Here.
Thank you. Vincent Ravishir, alternate for Eric Gertler, Acting Commissioner, New York State Department of Economic Development and President and Chief Executive Officer Designate, Empire State Development.
Here.
Thank you. John Williams, alternate of Richard Kaufman, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Here.
Thank you. Secretary Phillips, are there any changes to the agenda?
There are no changes to the agenda.
Thank you. Then let's get right to that agenda. We're taking up case 20F0067, the matter of the rules and regulations of the Board on Electric Generation, Siting, and the Environment, contained in 16 NYCRR Chapter X10, Certification of Major Electric Generating Facilities. Proposed amendments to Parts 1000 and 1001, presented by Robert Rosenthal, General Counsel. Mr. Rosenthal, please begin.
Thank you, Chair Rhodes. Let me just start by hoping that everybody on this meeting and otherwise participating is doing well. As noted by the Chair, I'm going to start with a discussion of the rulemaking that is in front of you today. On February 13, 2020, this board approved an emergency rulemaking to modify the definition of the term revision and related provisions of the original regulations adopted to implement Article 10 of the Public Service Law. The purpose of the regulatory changes was to address the fact that the definition of revision was creating unintended negative consequences, the most prominent of which is to cause unwarranted delays in permitting and construction of wind energy projects. These delays, in turn, could potentially render projects uneconomic for several reasons, including by making them ineligible for a federal tax credit set to expire at the end of 2020, and by failing to meet construction milestones tied to project financing. The definition of revision included in the original regulations incorporated a bright line test that would be triggered if project components like an access road, transmission interconnection, or turbine are relocated by more than 500 feet. As explained during my presentation regarding the emergency regulations, this test is particularly problematic for wind projects, where turbines associated with a single project can be sited on dozens of parcels. As noted then, it is fairly typical for the developer to relocate project components during the construction design phase of the project, which occurs after the issuance of the certificate. Additionally, given the duration of Article 10 certificate proceedings, the project developer may decide to substitute into a certificated project more efficient technologies or technologies that recently came on the market. Anyway, When this board approved the emergency rulemaking on February 22nd, it also approved for publication in the State Register a notice of proposed rulemaking to finalize the same set of proposed regulatory changes. Like any rulemaking under SAPA, the public was afforded a 60-day public comment process. The comments, to the extent opposing the final rule, advanced two general arguments. First, that the emergency justification underlying the board's initial action was unwarranted. And second, the proposed regulatory changes would hinder public involvement and result in increased negative impacts to the environment. As a purely legal matter, the first concern questioning the emergency nature of the board's initial action would be rendered moot by the board's final action today on the final rule, and that's because the final rule would replace the emergency rule, which would no longer be legally challengeable. In any event, the order approving the emergency rulemaking sufficiently established the emergency basis of the rulemaking, some of which I summarized at the outset of this presentation. As for the comments claiming that the final rule would undermine public involvement in the Article 10 process and result in increased environmental impacts, the order before you finds to the contrary. The important role that interveners play in the pre-application and application processes would remain unchanged. Interveners would still be provided with funding by the applicant and afforded the same rights as the applicant in the evidentiary hearing process. The intervener's role is important precisely because it focuses the process on critical local issues, including with respect to wind, noise impacts, setbacks, flicker, and visual impacts. Due in large part to the role played by interveners, the evidentiary hearing process results in strict and comprehensive certificate, standards, and conditions that apply to these projects. The standards and conditions of a certificate are intended to ensure that the project either avoids significant adverse environmental impacts or mitigates such impacts to the greatest extent practical. Those standards and conditions will remain applicable to any project changes subject to certificate amendment. This is important because under the new definition of revision, the applicant would be required to show that the project changes would not result in potential new or increased significant adverse environmental impacts compared to those evaluated as part of the certificate process. To do that, the applicant would have to show that the project changes would be able to comply to strict standards and conditions of the previously issued certificate, which again are based on the same test that addresses the significance of environmental and other impacts. In sum, because the regulatory changes at issue here ensure that the environmental significance review applies to any changes subject to a project amendment, there is no basis to believe that the regulatory changes themselves will result in increased environmental impacts. For these reasons, the emergency rulemaking that you have already approved should be made final pursuant to your action today. And with that, let me know if you have any questions on this initial issue. Thank you. Chair Rhodes, any questions?
Thank you for that gentle reminder. I was on mute. Thank you. My own comment is that as in the emergency rulemaking, I find these changes to be reasonable, pragmatic, and protective, of course, of community concerns, but also of environmental concerns and of the public opportunity to comment. Since these are preserved, and since we are improving the practical realities of the process, I am going to be in favor. Are there any comments or questions from my fellow board members? Mr. Alexander?
I have no questions.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis-Michael?
No questions.
Thank you. Mr. Ravashir?
No questions.
Thank you. And Mr. Williams?
Mr. Williams, I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry, no questions.
Thank you. With that, let's proceed to call for a vote. My own vote is in favor of adopting the memorandum and resolutions as final rule as just described. And for avoidance of doubt, this is John Rhodes voting. Mr. Alexander, how do you vote?
I vote in favor.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis Michael, how do you vote?
In favor.
Thank you. Mr. Ravashir, how do you vote?
In favor.
Thank you. And Mr. Williams, how do you vote?
In favor.
Thank you. The matter is approved and the recommendation is adopted. We will now move to the next item on the agenda, case 15F0122, application of Barron Winds LLC for a certificate of environmental compatibility and public need pursuant to Article 10 to construct a wind energy facility, again presented by Mr. Rosenthal. Mr. Rosenthal, please begin.
Thank you, Chair Rhodes. The next matter relates to an amendment sought by Barron Winds to a certificate issued by this board on September 12, 2019. As brief background, the certificate approved a wind energy project having a capacity of up to 242 megawatts to be located within the towns of Cohocton, Dansville, Fremont, and Wayland in Steuben County. The project as certificated would have spread the 242 megawatts over 69 wind turbines. On March 9, 2020, Barron Winds filed an amendment petition requesting the siting board to amend certain aspects of the certificate. The amendment petition seeks approval to modify certain project components, including changes to wind turbine size and technology and associated access roads and electrical collection lines. The proposed amendment would also divide the project into two phases. In phase one, Barron Winds would use a different turbine technology that would increase the capacity of individual turbines from 3.55 to 5 megawatts, spread out over 26 turbines, keeping the overall capacity of the project constant between phases 1 and 2, in other words, 242 megawatts, means that this increase in per turbine capacity as part of phase 1 would result in the overall number of turbines included as part of the total project being significantly reduced. If phase 2 of the project also uses 5 megawatt turbines, then the number of turbines for the entire project would be reduced from 69 to 48. If phase 2 uses a 3.55 megawatt turbine average, which was approved as part of the certificate, then the total number of turbines would be reduced from 69 to 54. As noted in my presentation earlier this morning regarding the new definition of revision, the company needs to show that the changes brought through the amendment would not result in potential new or increased significant adverse environmental impacts associated with the full project. Also, as noted, Barron Winds must do this by showing that the project changes would be able to comply with the standards and conditions incorporated into the previously issued certificate. The draft order before you finds that Barron has made this showing. So using the same example as I used in my presentation related to the rulemaking, with the changes proposed as part of phase 1, the project as a whole would still meet the standards and conditions incorporated into the certificate as related to noise, flicker, setback, wetlands, and all of the remaining impacts associated with the project as certificated. One issue of note is that the visual impacts would change as a result of the proposed amendment, but in an insignificant way. Specifically, the different turbine technology associated with phase 1 would increase the turbine height of the 26 turbines included in phase 1 from 500 to 650 feet. However, to be conservative, the amendment assumes under the visual analysis that all of the remaining 43 turbines authorized under the certificate would be built as part of Phase 2, even though, as I noted, the likelihood would be that that number would be significantly reduced. In this respect, the submission made by Barron shows that the perceptible area of visibility would be increased by 4.7 square miles within a visual study area of 569.2 square miles, which represents an incremental increase in the area of visibility of less than 1%. After consulting with agency staff regarding these issues, the Secretary found that the proposed amendment did not constitute a revision. In other words, that the project changes would not result in new or increased significant adverse environmental and other impacts. The order before you would adopt that finding and approve the certificate amendment sought by Barron Winds here. One more issue. We learned at a filing made on Monday, 2 days ago, that the town of Cohocton, where the 26 turbines would be built, may take action regarding the part of the town's law that authorizes turbine heights up to 650 feet. Article 10 requires this board to make a determination regarding whether the proposed amendments made by Barron Winds would comply with existing law, not a local law that may be changed in the future. Based on our review of the record, the part of the town law regarding turbine height remains in effect and has not been changed or repealed. Accordingly, the draft order also finds that the proposed changes in the amendment petition comply with existing town law. And with that, I remain open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. This is John Rhodes. I'm going to be in favor of this recommendation to approve the amendment request. I find that the amendments meet the test and that the applicant has properly shown, and I also note that staff has finds the same thing, has properly shown no new negative or no increased negative consequences, including the visual impact analysis. And I accept and concur with Council's review of the legal status of existing town law and whether this complies. I'm going to be in favor of this item. Are there any comments or questions from my fellow board members? Mr. Alexander?
I have no questions.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis-Michael?
No questions.
Thank you. Mr. Ravashir?
I have no questions.
Thank you. And Mr. Williams?
No questions.
Thank you. With that, I will proceed to call for a vote. My own vote is in favor of the recommendation to approve the amendment request. And for avoidance of doubt, this is John Rhodes voting. Mr. Alexander, how do you vote?
I vote in favor.
Dr. Lewis-Michael, how do you vote?
In favor.
Thank you. Mr. Ravashir, how do you vote?
In favor.
Thank you. Mr. Williams, how do you vote?
In favor.
Thank you. The matter is approved and the recommendation is adopted. Secretary Phillips, is there anything further to come before us today?
This is Secretary Phillips. There's nothing further to come before you today.
Thank you very much. Then I adjourn, and once again, this is John Rhodes adjourning the meeting. Thank you very much, all, for making this format work. Stay safe, everybody.